Hello and welcome to lesson 6-5, the legacy of the war. Today we're going to be looking at the aftermaths of World War II and its costs on society. World War II brought absolute devastation to Europe and East Asia. As you can see from these images up here, cities were just absolutely destroyed. Thousands of people died in this conflict. Millions of people died in this conflict. Both sides had fought a type of war called total war. It wasn't just army against army, soldier against soldier. Cities and civilians were treated like armies. They were targeted. They were destroyed intentionally. Civilians were killed because they might supply the army. This type of total warfare is really devastating to any society. The human cost total up to astronomical numbers. The war killed as many as 20 million soldiers and 50 million civilians. This number right here, that doesn't include soldiers, okay? It's 20 million soldiers and 50 million non-combatants, people who were sitting in these buildings when they were bombed. 70 million people died in this war. The Soviet Union had the heaviest losses. They lost more than 20 million people in the war. 20 million. One country lost 20 million people fighting against the Germans. China also had devastating losses, losing more than 12 million people to Japan. Huge numbers of loss. Now, the U.S. had relatively few compared to other nations. We lost virtually no civilians, and we had military losses of about 400,000 soldiers. 400,000 soldiers is a lot. It makes it the second deadliest war that the United States ever fought after the United States Civil War. This is a huge loss, but keep in mind the United States was only in this war for the last couple of years. The rest of Europe and East Asia had been fighting it for many years long. This is a chart which shows some of those death toll numbers. And you can see the red is our military deaths, the orange is our civilian deaths, and we can see how our nations line up with the Soviet Union, China, Poland, which had the bulk of the Holocaust victims, right up at that top of the list. And you follow that all the way down, and we get to the United States. The United States had relatively few. These down here are our Axis powers. So you can see, Germany wound up having quite a few losses there. They lost more than 7 million people in this war. Japan lost, also more than a couple of million. So they did not get off easily. But the deaths in this war, you can see in the circle graph, fell largely on the Allied side, with about 4 out of every 5 military deaths coming from the Allied powers. The war was also expensive economically. All sides had cities that were entirely destroyed because they did this as part of their strategy. Both sides did. Leningrad and Stalingrad in the Soviet Union were totally leveled, destroyed. Dresden in Germany, Tokyo in Japan, London in England were all largely destroyed in this fighting. The firebombing of Dresden and the firebombings of Tokyo leveled those cities. The U.S., in comparison, remained in pretty good economic condition. We didn't lose any cities. There were no battles fought on U.S. territory with the exception of Pearl Harbor. So the United States was in good economic condition. So one of the things that we did was President Truman gave Europe about $13 billion to help them rebuild. Now, this was conditional. This money was spent largely helping American companies go into Europe and help rebuild. Not entirely, but there was a large economic aspect of that. But it did help Europe to rebuild their nation. Costs of defeat. The Allies didn't want to punish Germany as a nation. They realized that after World War I, that didn't work. Okay, it was German resentment over how poorly they were treated after World War I that had pushed them into the arms of Adolf Hitler. They didn't want to punish the nation, punish the people. They instead wanted to focus on those who were most guilty. They wanted to focus on the Nazi Party. And so trials were held, and top Nazi Party leaders were accused of specific crimes. And in these Nuremberg trials in Nuremberg, Germany, they held these court cases where about 200 Nazi leaders were found guilty of war crimes. Many of those 200, not all of them, but many of them were executed for this crime. So we were killing Nazis for what they did during the war. But we did not punish Germany as a nation. So the world changes after the war. In 1945, the United States and other nations were all trying to readjust to the fact that we were no longer in this 7-year, incredibly deadly conflict. But each nation had to decide what they were going to do, how they were going to transition out of war, how were they going to handle millions of soldiers returning home. What were they going to do with the territory that they'd captured? How were they going to make sure that future wars did not happen? Well, let's start with those soldiers returning home. In 1945, the U.S. had millions of unemployed former soldiers. Okay, 3 million American men, more than 3 million American men coming home without a job. Well, one of the things we did was we passed the GI Bill of Rights. This is a law designed to help returning soldiers. It provided them low-cost or free college education. So men who fought in World War II could go to college and the government would pay for it. You could also get other types of career training so that you could get a good job. We wanted to make sure that these soldiers had good opportunities, and in order to have a good opportunity in life, you have to have a good education. It also helped create affordable housing for soldiers. Soldiers were able to get cheap, low-cost loans to buy a house and settle down. So the last thing we want is a whole bunch of soldiers running around with nothing to do and no jobs. That would not be good. So we addressed both of those problems. To solve the problem of world peace in the future, world leaders got together at a conference called Yalta, the Yalta Conference. And the Allies had decided that the League of Nations was a total failure. It didn't work, partially because the United States wasn't a member. So we needed to get something that the United States could be on board with. And so they replaced the League of Nations with the United Nations, the UN, which still exists today. At its first meeting, which was held in San Francisco, California, United States, 50 nations attended and 50 nations joined. Today, there are over 190 members of the United Nations, almost all nations on Earth. Also out of World War II came the creation of Israel. The United Nations was not entirely successful at resolving all these international issues, and Israel was one of those big ones. What do we do with the Jewish population in Europe, and how do we make sure that they are able to stay protected from those who would do them harm like Hitler? Well, in 1948, the UN stepped in to create a new nation. They created the nation of Israel. They did this in a former British colonial territory of Palestine. Now, the Palestinians were largely Arabs and did not like the fact that they had been colonized by the British. They worked with the British to fight against the Germans in the hope that they would have their own country afterward. And then the UN came in and said, sorry, Palestinians, we're going to create Israel instead. Israelis celebrated the creation of a homeland, but this triggered almost immediate conflict in the region, which has never been resolved. Arab neighbors of the Palestinians and the Palestinians themselves were angered and enraged by the creation of this nation of Israel. And they almost immediately fell into war. And they've been in a cycle of war or other conflict virtually ever since. We also have the start of the Cold War. Now, the Cold War will be a topic for us that we go into in much greater depth. We'll spend a lot of time on it. But this is where it begins. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, the USSR, had promised to return its captured territory, that they had marched into Eastern Europe. Here's the USSR borders. They had marched into Eastern Europe simply to evict the Germans, to force them out of Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. They were forcing them out of those nations. But instead, Stalin imposed communist governments. They set up governments in each of those countries that would follow the Soviet communist model, and they were largely puppet states. They would do whatever the Soviet Union told them to do. Now, Winston Churchill, the leader of Great Britain, called this the descent of an Iron Curtain. An Iron Curtain falling across Europe. Right here is our Iron Curtain, dividing Europe into two, with England and the other Allied powers on one side and the Soviet Union and their, puppet states on the other. Churchill was pretty sure that this would signify the start of another conflict. Churchill even believed that it might be another world war, and at one point advocated that World War II should not end with the capture of Berlin. It should instead end with the capture of Moscow. But cooler heads prevailed. We did not have a continuation of World War II or World War III. What we wound up with instead was the Cold War, a long period of time with hostility, but no open warfare. All right, so we covered a lot today. We talked about the costs of war in terms of human costs and economic costs, what happened to the Nazis after the war. We talked about changes, both at home and abroad, with treating American troops well and creating the League of Nations. We talked about setting up new tensions, both in Israel and in the Cold War. And we will be getting into this Cold War topic in much greater detail pretty soon. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you learned something, and farewell.